The evening air was crisp, carrying the distant hum of city life as Alicia Carter stepped out of a luxury boutique in downtown Manhattan. Dressed in an elegant black dress and a tailored camel-colored coat, she exuded confidence with every step she took on the marble sidewalk. The glimmer of a streetlight reflected off her diamond earrings, subtle but unmistakable. Alicia was no stranger to attention. She had spent years in the public eye as an advocate for social justice, and, more importantly, as the wife of one of the most powerful men in the country, Ethan Carter, the Secretary of the Interior. She barely noticed the police cruiser parked across the street as she adjusted the strap of her handbag. What she did notice, however, was the way the officer inside the car stiffened, his eyes locking onto her with a look she had seen too many times before. Officer Marcus White had been on patrol for hours, frustrated with the long shift and eager for something to break the monotony. When his gaze landed on Alicia, an affluent black woman stepping out of a high-end boutique, his suspicions immediately flared. He had spent years on the force, and in his mind, he knew how to spot trouble before it started. A black woman in designer clothing, alone at night, it didn't add up, not to him. He stepped out of his cruiser, his boots hitting the pavement with purpose, one hand instinctively resting on his utility belt. "Ma'am," he called out, his tone clipped and authoritative. Alicia turned slowly, her dark eyes narrowing as she met his gaze. "Yes, officer." Marcus took a step closer, eyeing her bag. "May I see your receipt?" Alicia's brow furrowed. "Excuse me?" "Your receipt," he repeated, his posture rigid. "From the store. You just walked out of there." Alicia let out a slow breath, her fingers tightening around the strap of her handbag. She had encountered situations like this before, too many times to count. She knew the script, knew how it would go. "And why exactly do you need to see my receipt?" Marcus tilted his head slightly, taking another step closer, the faint smell of coffee and cologne wafting from his uniform. "Routine check, ma'am. Just making sure everything's in order." Alicia held her ground. "Routine check? Do you ask every woman walking out of this store for her receipt? Or just the black ones?" The words made something flicker across Marcus's face. Annoyance, perhaps, or something darker. "Just show me the receipt, and we won't have a problem." Alicia exhaled sharply, reaching into her handbag and pulling out the neatly folded piece of paper. She held it out for him, her hand steady. Marcus barely glanced at it before snatching it from her fingers, inspecting it as if he expected to find some discrepancy. "You live around here?" he asked, handing the receipt back. Alicia's patience thinned. "Officer, I don't need to answer that. Am I being detained?" Marcus's jaw tightened. He didn't like being challenged, especially not by someone who spoke with the kind of confidence that suggested she had power. "Step aside, ma'am. I need to check your bag." Alicia crossed her arms. "Not without a warrant." That was when Marcus's temper snapped. His hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with unnecessary force. "Do not resist," he ordered, his voice laced with hostility. Alicia yanked her hand back. "Take your hands off me." In an instant, Marcus shoved her against the police cruiser, pinning her arms behind her back. Alicia gasped as the cold metal pressed against her cheek. "You're under suspicion of theft," he said, twisting the cuffs around her wrists. "You're making a mistake." Alicia growled. "A very big mistake." Marcus smirked as he locked the cuffs. "Yeah? We'll see about that." What he didn't realize, what he couldn't have known, was just how right she was. Marcus drove back to the precinct with a firm grip on the wheel, Alicia sitting stiffly in the back seat, her hands cuffed behind her. His mind was still buzzing with adrenaline. He had done the right thing, he told himself. A woman like that, walking around acting like she owned the city, she had to be up to something. At the station, the moment he stepped through the doors, something shifted. The atmosphere, once filled with the casual banter of officers finishing their shifts, suddenly turned cold. Captain Harris, a heavy-set man with graying hair and a reputation for no-nonsense leadership, was standing near the front desk. His expression darkened the moment he saw Alicia. "Marcus," he said, his voice dangerously low. "What the hell did you just do?" Marcus frowned. "What do you mean?" She was acting suspicious. "So I brought her in for questioning." Harris rubbed a hand down his face as murmurs spread through the station. Officers exchanged glances, some shifting uncomfortably, others already backing away from the brewing storm. "Do you have any idea who she is?" Harris hissed, stepping closer. Marcus scoffed. "No, and I don't care. She resisted an officer, and I followed protocol." "Protocol?" Harris repeated, his voice rising. "Jesus Christ. Marcus, that woman is Alicia Carter, the wife of Ethan Carter." The name hit Marcus like a freight train. His face paled. "You mean?" "Yes," Harris snapped. "The Ethan Carter, the Secretary of the Interior, the man who oversees our goddamn police reform policies, the man who has the power to bury this entire department if he wants to." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "He's already been notified," Harris continued. "And let me tell you something, Marcus, you are in deep shit." For the first time, Marcus felt real fear coil in his chest. Ethan Carter was in his office when the call came. He had spent the evening reviewing policies on police misconduct, a subject that had plagued the country for too long. When his phone buzzed with an urgent message, he almost ignored it until he saw the name on the screen. Alicia, arrested, police brutality. For a long moment, Ethan sat frozen, staring at the screen. Then, a slow, terrifying fury rose in his chest. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the polished hardwood floor. "Get me Commissioner Reynolds," he ordered his aide. His voice was dangerously calm. "And tell them I'm on my way." By the time Marcus was escorted to the briefing room, the video had already gone viral. Alicia's arrest had been filmed by multiple bystanders, capturing every second of Marcus's aggression. The internet exploded with outrage. News outlets were running the footage on a loop. Activists were calling for immediate action. Marcus watched in horror as his name trended on social media, accompanied by words like racist, thug, monster. His career was no longer just at risk, it was over, and soon, he would learn that his life as he knew it was about to crumble. Because Ethan Carter wasn't just coming for his badge. He was coming for everything. Marcus White sat in a cold, windowless office inside the precinct, his knee bouncing anxiously. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him like an avalanche. The reality of his actions, which had seemed so justified only an hour ago, was now a swirling storm of consequences he never saw coming. His phone buzzed incessantly in his pocket, but he didn't dare look at it. He already knew what the world was saying. His name was out there. His face was everywhere. Captain Harris stormed into the room, his expression a mask of barely contained fury. He slammed a thick file down on the desk, the papers inside barely staying together. "Congratulations, White," Harris said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You just became the most hated cop in the country." Marcus swallowed hard. "Captain, You shut the hell up." Harris stabbed a finger toward him, his eyes blazing. "Do you have any idea what you've done? I have the goddamn Secretary of the Interior breathing down my neck, the mayor calling me every 5 minutes, and the goddamn commissioner is 2 seconds away from issuing a public apology for you." Marcus clenched his jaw. "I was just doing my job. She was resisting." "Shut up, Marcus." Harris exhaled through his nose, trying to rein in his temper. "She was resisting? Are you serious? We have footage. For fuck's sake. She did nothing but stand up for herself. And you lost your goddamn mind. You're lucky she's not pressing assault charges yet." Marcus looked away, staring at the blank wall, his hands clenched into fists. "You're officially suspended," Harris said. "Indefinitely. Badge. Gun. Now." Marcus's stomach turned. "Captain, please." This is a witch hunt. I. Harris slammed his fist on the desk. Badge. Gun. Now. Marcus felt his throat tighten, but he unhooked his badge from his belt, unholstered his gun, and placed both on the desk. The weight of them leaving his hands felt heavier than he expected. Harris grabbed them without another word and turned to leave, pausing only at the door. Go home, Marcus, and pray to God this doesn't get worse. Marcus wanted to argue, wanted to say something, anything to defend himself. But for the first time in his life, he had no words. By the time Marcus stepped out of the precinct, the world had already decided his fate. A crowd had gathered outside the station, their voices rising in anger. Protesters held up signs reading "No justice." "No peace" and "Racist cops must go." Camera crews swarmed the area, reporters shouting questions he refused to answer. He shoved past them, his heart hammering as he reached his car. He had always thought of himself as untouchable. Cops like him didn't get punished. Cops like him were protected. But now, with the entire city turning against him, he wasn't so sure anymore. His phone rang. Jessica, his wife, the woman he had spent the last 10 years building a life with. He hesitated, then answered. Jess. Marcus. What the fuck is happening? Her voice was sharp, panicked. I just got a call from the school. They want me to take Aaron out for a few days because of safety concerns. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? Marcus's grip on the steering wheel tightened. It's not what they're making it out to be. The media is twisting this. Twisting it. Jessica let out a bitter laugh. Marcus, I saw the video. The whole world saw the video. You attacked that woman like she was some kind of criminal. You humiliated her. And now our son is paying for it. Marcus's stomach twisted. Jess, you know I'm not a racist. I don't know anything anymore, she said, her voice trembling. I just know that our lives are falling apart because of you. Silence stretched between them before Jessica sighed. I'm taking Aaron to my parents' house for a while. We need space. Marcus felt his chest tighten. Jess, please, don't do this. I don't have a choice. Her voice was softer now, but it carried a finality that made his blood run cold. Fix this, Marcus, if you even can. The call ended, leaving Marcus alone in his car, the weight of his choices pressing down on him like a crushing force. At the Carter residence, Alicia sat in the dimly lit living room, her hands clasped around a steaming cup of tea. Her wrist still ached from where Marcus had grabbed her. No matter how many times she replayed the scene in her head, she couldn't shake the humiliation, the anger. Ethan paced in front of her, his jaw set, his fury barely contained. We're pressing charges. Alicia looked up at him. Ethan. No. He stopped, his dark eyes burning with determination. This isn't just about you, Alicia. This is about every black person who's ever been humiliated, brutalized, or killed by men like him. We are pressing charges. I don't care what it takes. Alicia exhaled slowly, setting her cup down. You know what's going to happen if we do this. The threats, the attacks, the smear campaigns. They're already calling me a liar on TV. Ethan knelt beside her, taking her hands. I don't care. They can say whatever they want. This man needs to face justice. She studied him for a long moment before nodding. Okay. Ethan kissed her knuckles before standing. I'm calling the best civil rights attorneys in the country. We're taking this as far as it needs to go. And with that, the fight for justice truly began. Marcus had always thought himself untouchable. But sitting in his darkened living room, whiskey in hand, watching news anchors tear his life apart on live television, he realized just how wrong he had been. Every network replayed the footage over and over, dissecting his every move, his every word. Analysts called for his arrest. Protesters demanded his conviction. His name was being spoken with disgust by millions. And then, his phone rang again, a number he didn't recognize. Against his better judgment, he answered. You ruined your life, pig. A voice sneered. And we're gonna make sure you suffer for it. The line went dead. Marcus stared at his phone, his pulse pounding. His world was collapsing. His career was gone. His wife had left. His son was being shunned at school. And now, he was receiving death threats. For the first time in his life, Marcus felt something he had never truly known. Fear. Real. Unshakable. Gut-wrenching fear. And deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. Marcus had never known what it felt like to be hunted. He had spent years as the predator, the one in control, the one making the decisions. Now, it was different. Now, he was the one being watched, the one being whispered about in the shadows. It started subtly at first. His neighbors no longer made eye contact when he passed them in the hallway. The barista at his favorite coffee shop refused to serve him. A group of teenagers on the street snickered as they passed, one of them muttering, "There goes the racist cop." Then, it escalated. A brick smashed through his car window one evening. A crude note was spray-painted on his apartment door. "Murderer." Online, his home address was leaked, along with a list of places he frequented. His phone rang at all hours of the night with threats, some vague, some terrifyingly specific. Marcus sat in his living room, staring at his phone as another unknown number called. He ignored it. The voicemail that followed was chilling. "You're gonna pay for what you did." He exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around the glass of whiskey in his hand. The news played in the background, showing footage of the growing protests outside the police precinct. His name flashed across the screen, followed by words that made his stomach turn. Marcus White, a suspended officer under investigation for police brutality, is facing increasing public outrage. Civil rights groups are calling for his immediate arrest, while others are demanding systemic change in law enforcement. The Secretary of the Interior, Alicia Carter, has vowed to pursue justice against White with full legal force. White has yet to issue a public apology or statement. He turned off the TV, the silence in the apartment deafening. He was out of options, and for the first time, he realized there was no going back. Jessica stood in the doorway of their home, his home, now her face drawn, her eyes filled with something colder than anger. It was disappointment. She had come back only to pack up her things, a task that should have taken hours but was done in mere minutes. She didn't need much. Most of her life had already been uprooted the moment Marcus became a national disgrace. Their son, Aaron, had refused to come inside. He sat in the car, his headphones on, his small fingers gripping his phone too tightly. He hadn't spoken to Marcus since the incident. Jessica sighed, rubbing a hand over her face. "This is the last time I'll be here, Marcus." He swallowed hard, standing awkwardly in the hallway, his hands clenched at his sides. "Jess, please, we can't." She interrupted, shaking her head. "It's done." He looked past her, toward the car outside. "Aaron won't even look at me. Can you blame him?" Jessica let out a shaky breath, struggling to keep herself composed. "He used to be proud of you, his dad, the police officer, the man who was supposed to protect people." Marcus flinched. "You know I was just doing my job." "No," she said, her voice sharp. "You weren't. You were abusing your power, Marcus. And now, our son is paying the price for it." Silence stretched between them. Jessica finally picked up her bag, shifting it over her shoulder. "I don't know where we're going yet. My parents' place for now. Maybe somewhere further later. But we can't stay here. Not while your face is on every news channel." He nodded stiffly, his throat burning. She hesitated for a moment, as if considering saying something else. But in the end, she simply turned and walked out the door. Marcus watched her go, standing frozen in the doorway long after the car had disappeared down the street. And just like that, his family was gone. The legal documents arrived the next day. Marcus sat at his kitchen table, staring at the crisp white envelope as if it were a ticking time bomb. He didn't need to open it to know what it was. The lawsuit. Alicia Carter had followed through on his promise. His hands shook as he tore open the envelope, scanning the dense legal jargon inside. Civil rights violations, unlawful detainment, use of excessive force, emotional distress. The charges stacked against him were damning. The number at the bottom of the document made his breath hitch. $5 million in damages. His laugh was dry, humorless. I don't even have $5,000. He was already drowning. His suspension meant no paycheck. His savings were dwindling. His reputation was destroyed. And now, he was facing a lawsuit that could leave him bankrupt for life. His phone buzzed. A message from his lawyer. "Call me. We need to talk." Marcus ran a hand over his face, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle into his bones. He had spent years thinking himself untouchable. Now, the walls were closing in, and he had no one left to turn to. Marcus sat alone in his apartment, the dim glow of the city casting shadows against the walls. The bottle of whiskey sat half empty on the table, next to the crumpled lawsuit papers. He was out of options. His career was over. His wife and son were gone. The world had turned against him. A knock at the door startled him. He frowned, standing up unsteadily. No one had come to see him in days, no friends, no colleagues, no family. Who the hell would be knocking at this hour? He opened the door to find an older black man standing there, dressed in a dark suit. The man's face was lined with age, his gaze sharp yet unreadable. "Officer White," the man said evenly. Marcus narrowed his eyes. "Who are you?" "My name is Thomas Reed. I'm a retired detective." The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather badge, flipping it open briefly before tucking it away again. "I came to talk." Marcus scoffed. "Talk? About what? How I'm a disgrace. How I deserve everything that's happening to me." Thomas tilted his head slightly. "About why you did what you did." Marcus's breath caught in his throat. I was just doing my job. That's what they all say," Thomas replied, his tone neither accusing nor sympathetic. "Tell me, Officer White, if she hadn't been the wife of the Secretary of the Interior, would you have even thought twice about what you did?" Silence. Marcus clenched his jaw. "You don't know me." "No," Thomas admitted. "But I know men like you. I worked with them. Some of them learned. Some of them didn't. And the ones who didn't, well, they ended up just like you. Or worse." Marcus's chest tightened. Thomas studied him for a moment before stepping back. "I'll be at Murphy's Diner tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock. If you want to talk, really talk, you'll know where to find me." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Marcus stood in the doorway long after he was gone, his mind racing. For the first time in days, he wondered if there was still a way out of this, or if he was already too far gone. Marcus barely slept that night. The weight of everything, his disgrace, the lawsuit, the threats, pressed against him like a boulder on his chest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Alicia's face, her fury, her pain. He saw the videos, the protests, the disgusted looks of his fellow officers. He saw Jessica walking away, Aaron refusing to look at him. By the time his alarm buzzed at 5 a.m., he was already awake, sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the lawsuit papers scattered across the coffee table. He wasn't sure why he grabbed his jacket. He wasn't sure why he got into his car and drove through the quiet, empty streets of the city. He wasn't sure why he ended up at Murphy's Diner, the neon sign flickering against the early morning darkness, the smell of coffee and bacon filling the air as he stepped inside. Thomas Reed was already there, sitting in a booth by the window, a steaming cup of black coffee in front of him. He didn't look surprised to see Marcus. Without a word, Marcus slid into the seat across from him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The waitress came by, pouring Marcus a cup of coffee. He barely acknowledged her, his fingers wrapping around the warm ceramic. Finally, Thomas broke the silence. "You look like hell." Marcus let out a bitter chuckle. "Feels about right." Thomas took a slow sip of his coffee. watching him carefully. "Why'd you come?" Marcus stared at the table. He had no answer. "Because you know you fucked up," Thomas continued. "And for the first time, you don't know how to fix it." Marcus exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "What do you want from me?" "I don't want anything from you," Thomas said, his voice calm. "I just want to understand. What made you look at that woman and decide she was a criminal? What made you push her against your car? Cuff her? Humiliate her?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "She was acting suspicious." Thomas's expression darkened. "Don't give me that bullshit. White. You and I both know that if she were a white woman in designer clothes, you wouldn't have looked at her twice." Marcus's throat burned. He wanted to argue. He wanted to push back. But deep down, he knew Thomas was right. "I don't know," he admitted quietly. "I don't know why I did it." Thomas leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. "Yeah, you do. You just don't want to say it out loud." Silence. Marcus swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around his coffee cup. For the first time, he let himself really wonder if Thomas was right. Thomas leaned back in his seat, studying Marcus with a quiet intensity. "Let me tell you something, White. I've been in this business a long time. I started in the force back in the 70s. You think things are bad now? You should have seen it then. Back when I first put on the badge. Black men like me weren't just hated, we were targets." Marcus shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. "I had to prove myself every single goddamn day," Thomas continued. "Not just to the public, but to my own damn colleagues. They saw me as a traitor, said I was a credit to my race if I did my job well, and a disgrace if I didn't. But I stayed. I stayed because I wanted to change things from the inside. And for a long time, I thought I was making a difference." His voice grew quieter. "But then I started realizing, one man can't change a system that doesn't want to be changed." Marcus looked up, something cold settling in his stomach. "You think the system's broken?" Thomas let out a low, humorless chuckle. "Son, the system isn't broken. It's working exactly the way it was built to work." Marcus frowned, his mind racing. "You think I don't know men like you?" Thomas said, his voice softer now. "You think I haven't worked alongside them? Good cops, bad cops, and the ones who think they're good but are just following orders. The ones who never question why they pull over more black drivers, why they stop more black men on the street, why they feel threatened every time a black person so much as raises their voice." Marcus flinched. Thomas sighed. "You want to fix this? You need to start by looking in the mirror." Marcus clenched his jaw, staring down at his coffee. For the first time in his life, he had no idea who the man looking back at him was. Marcus drove aimlessly through the city, Thomas's words echoing in his head. His entire career, he had seen himself as the good guy, the protector, the one standing between chaos and order. But what if he had been wrong? What if he had been the problem all along? His phone buzzed. A news alert. Breaking. Civil rights attorneys announce major lawsuit against suspended Officer Marcus White. His name, plastered across every screen in America. His reputation, shredded beyond repair. A call came through. His lawyer. He didn't answer. What was the point? He had already lost everything. Marcus parked outside a rundown motel on the outskirts of the city. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The lawsuit, the threats, the protests, Jessica leaving, Aaron hating him. He had spent his entire life thinking he was in control, thinking he was the one with power. But power was an illusion. And now, he had nothing. He reached for the glove compartment, fingers trembling as he pulled it open. The cold steel of his old service pistol glinted under the dim motel light. For a long moment, he just stared at it. Then, his phone buzzed again. A message from an unknown number. "You're not the first. You won't be the last. But you still have a choice." His breath hitched. He looked back at the gun. Then, at the message. And for the first time, he hesitated. The motel room was silent except for the faint hum of the flickering ceiling fan. The gun lay heavy in Marcus's lap, the weight of it pressing into his thigh like a physical manifestation of everything crushing down on him. The message on his phone glowed in the dim light, its words digging into his mind like hooks. You're not the first. You won't be the last. But you still have a choice. A choice. He had spent his entire life believing he was the one making the choices, that he was in control, that he was the law. And yet, here he was, reduced to nothing, gripping a gun like a coward looking for an escape. His phone buzzed again. Another message. Murphy's Diner. 9 a.m. Be there. No name. No explanation. Just an order. The kind he used to give. Marcus exhaled shakily, his hand tightening around the gun. A lifetime ago, he would have scoffed, ignored it. But now, he was standing at the edge of something he didn't understand. A place where all the lies he had told himself about justice, about right and wrong, about who he was were unraveling faster than he could stop them. Slowly, with shaking fingers, he put the gun down. He didn't know why, but he would go. Murphy's Diner was nearly empty when Marcus walked in, the smell of coffee and bacon thick in the air. It was the same as before, but different. The last time he had sat in that booth, he had been defensive, angry, convinced that Thomas Reed had come to preach at him. This time, he was just lost. Thomas was already there, a fresh cup of coffee in front of him. But this time, he wasn't alone. Alicia Carter sat across from him. Marcus stopped in his tracks, his stomach twisted, shame pooling in his gut like acid. He had imagined seeing her again 1,000 times, but never like this, never with him at his lowest and her looking at him with that same steely, unwavering gaze. Sit, Thomas said, motioning to the empty seat beside Alicia. Marcus hesitated, then did as he was told. For a long moment, no one spoke. Alicia sipped her coffee, then set the cup down with careful precision. Do you know why you're here? She asked, her voice calm but firm. Marcus swallowed. He cleared his throat. No. Alicia studied him, her dark eyes unreadable. You're here because I asked Thomas to bring you. Marcus's breath caught. Why would you do that? Because despite everything, she said, her voice measured. I want to know if you actually understand what you did, not just to me, but to every person who's ever been in my position. I want to know if you even realize the kind of damage you've done. Marcus felt his chest tighten. You think you lost everything? Alicia continued. Your job? Your reputation? Your family? You think that's new? You think you're the first person to have their life torn apart over a single incident? She shook her head, her expression unreadable. Black men and women have lost their lives. Marcus, not just their jobs, their lives. Over nothing. You pushed me against a car and threw cuffs on me because you didn't like that I questioned you. Because something inside you decided that a black woman with money must have stolen something. That's not an accident. That's a disease. Marcus looked away, shame twisting inside him. You don't have to say anything, she said after a moment. I just needed you to hear it. Thomas finally spoke. You still have a choice. White. The world is waiting for your answer. Marcus frowned. What answer? Alicia leaned forward, her gaze piercing. Are you going to be just another disgraced cop who disappears and blames the system for turning its back on him? Or are you going to face what you did and actually do something about it? Silence stretched between them. Marcus didn't know the answer. Not yet. But he knew one thing. For the first time, he wanted to find out. The press conference was held in the largest auditorium of the city courthouse. The room was packed: journalists, activists, police officers, government officials. And in the front row, Alicia and Ethan Carter sat side by side, their faces unreadable as they waited. Marcus stood backstage, his hands trembling at his sides. He wasn't supposed to be here. His lawyer had warned him against it. The police union had disavowed him. His so-called friends had turned their backs. But he had made his choice. He stepped forward, the bright lights nearly blinding him as the room fell silent. Cameras clicked. And then, he spoke. I was wrong. The words hung in the air, heavier than he had expected. He forced himself to continue. I was wrong that night. I was wrong in the way I saw people who didn't look like me. I was wrong in thinking I was always the one who was right. And I was wrong to believe that what I did to Alicia Carter wasn't a symptom of something deeper. Something that's been poisoning this country for too long. His voice wavered, but he kept going. I won't ask for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I will say this. I'm not the same man who put those cuffs on her. And I will spend the rest of my life proving that. Silence. Then murmurs. Then applause, slow at first. Then building. Not everyone clapped. Some sneered. Some shook their heads. But Alicia Carter stood. She didn't smile. She didn't offer him absolution. But she nodded. And for the first time, Marcus White felt something break inside him. Something that needed to be broken. Months passed. Marcus no longer wore a badge. He no longer walked the streets with a gun on his hip. But for the first time in his life, he was learning. He attended forums on police reform, sitting in the back of the room, listening to the stories of people who had suffered under the weight of the system he once upheld. He volunteered at legal aid centers, working with lawyers who helped the very people he had once arrested. He didn't ask for recognition. He didn't want it. He just wanted to understand. One evening, as he was leaving a community meeting, a familiar voice stopped him. You're still here. Marcus turned. Alicia Carter stood a few feet away, arms crossed. Yeah, he said. I am. She studied him for a long moment. People like you don't usually stick around. I'm not people like me anymore, he said quietly. She nodded once, then turned to leave. But before she did, she said something he never expected to hear. Keep going. Then, she was gone. Marcus stood in the dim glow of the streetlights, watching her disappear into the night. He would, for the first time in his life, he finally knew where he was going.